Oh, well, hello there, and welcome back to our discussion on art and media. And I wanted to start out this session with this exercise. How do we see art being displayed as a means of expressing power? And I think this is really important to understand the significance and the importance that art has within society. How are you portrayed in the media? Let's say you're African American. And as you are driving up and down the road, you hop on the freeway, you're driving around from location to location, and every time you see a billboard, on that billboard is someone that's white, right? And you're not seeing any representation of yourself in that, right? So when we think about marketing, people respond to seeing themselves being marketed to. Like this is something that is for me. But what happens when that isn't available? When you aren't seeing your own identity being represented in that marketing, right? How does that make you feel? What happens when you watch the evening news? Right, you're watching the evening news, and uh, an African American person is shown on the news, and it's a mugshot, right? And that mugshot, that's how um, you're typically portrayed. If you've, say you went out and you got a speeding ticket, and then something happened, right? And not a big deal, but it made the news. Um, you know, mugshot. Where you might have the same thing that happens with, say, a white guy gets arrested because he murdered his entire family. Instead of showing the mugshot, oftentimes they'll show a picture of the family, right? Mom, dad, couple of kids. Um, and there's, oh, this is such a tragedy that this guy went off and murdered his entire family. Don't show the mugshot, right? But they change the portrayal of the individual. Who is the villain? Who is the hero? Right? If we think about video games, what happens if you're playing? Um, uh, uh, um, oh my God, why can't I think of it? Like Modern Warfare, and this game in which the adversary um, is an Arab, right? And anytime you see that portrayal as the enemy. They're the terrorist, right? Call of Duty, right? That's what I was trying to think of. Every time that you play Call of Duty, you see the enemy, and who is that enemy, right? That is someone from Afghanistan or Iraq, um, and they're constantly being portrayed that way. But what happens if you are Afghani or have some sort of cultural or historical background? That's where you came from, and you're living here, but you see that, and you're portrayed as that constantly. And then when someone sees you and they've been playing Call of Duty over and over again, and then they see you out in the public, how is that going to influence their behavior towards you, right? What if you're a Native American and you are portrayed as the noble savage, right? This has been a trope that's been portrayed for decades, in which, anytime that you are portrayed on television, you are seen, you are typecast as this, like an environmental uh, advocate, but you live in a teepee, right? Or your connection to the earth is very strong, but you're still a savage. What happens when you're portrayed a certain way over and over and over again? What happens when your community, right? When you go to the museum and you're Native American and you walk into the Native American section in the Natural History Museum and you see artwork that looks just like what's inside your home, but it's seen here as a part of history and not a part of contemporary art. What kind of an impact does that have on you? Right. So these are things that we have to consider, not only as citizens of the world and the consumer of these arts, but as anthropologists, we try to understand the impact that these different types of art, these different styles of art, are having on those communities, right? And what kinds of biases are being um, used in the creation of this art. Okay, so art is an expression of identity. If your art is displayed, it is likely that your culture is the dominant culture. If it is not, then you are likely part of the minority culture, right? And that can be everything from religion to ethnicity to even gender, right? And how art is ultimately expressed. Um, if we think about the fine arts of our European legacy, we do not talk about women artists, right? There is no female equivalent of Mozart. Why? Why is that? We know, if only by example of Taylor Swift, that great music can be made by women. Why do we not have a legacy of that? What is it that has created that influence, that legacy coming down in time that has allowed us to look at this, what we consider to be fine art, and exclude half of the population from it? And there's that legacy that comes into play, right? That historical background. Um, so, right, that still has play today in the creation of music, in the creation of art, who is doing it, right, and who has access to those resources. Um, Using art can reinforce your culture and identity both in positive and negative ways. Um, if you are portraying people in a certain light in a television show or in a music video or in a movie, right? We've had lots of cases in movies where we have whitewashed um, characters in those movies. I think about old westerns in which a lot of those westerns, the Indians that were portrayed were actors in red face, right? They were put into makeup and made to look like Native Americans when actually they were white actors. Um, Even things like in modern day Marvel movies, I was thinking about Doctor Strange, right? And that the first Doctor Strange movie when he encounters the master that he's eventually going to learn from, was played by Tilda Swinton, who's a white woman, right? And the original character is an Asian man. Changing actors to sort of whitewash, and this is also creating a really interesting sort of effect, right? We're even looking at things like the Disney movies right now that are changing the ethnicity of like Snow White, and then looking at the backlash that's happening um, by people throughout the country, talking about the changing of this particular character to a different race, even though it's been done before many times on the other side. Um, it kind of stings when it's being done to you, right? So that kind of influence and power is really important to understand how different people are going to experience that art, and we can see it have either positive or negative impacts. Um, art and power. By selecting art that most represents certain concepts, you can effectively select portions of culture and art that might be or might not be indicative to the whole cultural identity. And what this means is that if you focus on one particular thing, let's take religion for example. Let's say that uh, most of the population is Christian, and their art dominates culture, even though there are practitioners of other religions around, right? But their art doesn't get displayed as much or at all. Um, so you can have art being used as a sort of a cultural weapon, right? If you can get more art up, then that can create more cultural change um, and can influence the behavior of people depending on what they experience, right? And art is everywhere. It influences everything that we do on a regular basis because some sort of design went into it, and people will choose how to consume it based on those sort of ideals. But what's important to recognize is what's available and what isn't there, right? What kind of art and media is not present. And that's just as important when you look at other cultures. Um, what art is there and what art isn't. Again, going back to my time in Kenya, seeing all of this Americana everywhere while I was in Nairobi or Mombasa, um, I saw all this American stuff, but I wasn't seeing as much traditional art that you would expect by going to one of these locations. And in fact, you had to go to touristy locations to see what we would consider to be that traditional artwork. And that's an interesting thing to think about, is the fact that that artwork is considered to be touristy, right? Meant for tourists to consume and to take back home with them rather than to be consumed at home, within your own culture. And we're seeing that shift of Americana becoming more and more of an influence versus um, that traditional artwork. So that can have a huge impact, right? And a lot of this can be done for a number of different reasons. Oversight, people just not paying attention to what's happening. Um, and this can be things like even thinking about racism for a second. Um, I was reminded of the unintentional design of automatic faucets, right? If you walk into a public bathroom and you stick your hand underneath the faucet and water comes out and splashes on your hands, and then you stick your hand underneath the hot air blower or the automatic paper towel dispenser. The interesting thing about that is when those were first designed, the technology that was used did not take into account darker pigment. So black hands and brown hands weren't triggering the water dispenser or the dryer or the paper towel dispenser. That wasn't done intentionally. It was an oversight, right? So not paying attention to what is happening. And that can be done in marketing. That can be done in the design of architecture, of city planning. You can have oversight in which things happen, right? And we don't want those things to happen, but they do. It can be done specifically for marketing or political or economic reasons, right? And oftentimes those decisions are intentional, right? Uh, who are you going to target for uh, particular skin care or hair care? Who are you going to target for moving into different communities, traveling across the tracks into suburban areas, having access to those kinds of resources, moving into an area and gentrifying that area because of the street art that is available in that area. Um, and recognizing that there are subtle differences, things that are happening in those communities that you're just simply not aware of, but are you know propagating. And then again, how is this reflected in television and movies? And we kind of talked a little bit about this. Uh, the portrayal of individuals, either in a positive or negative way, even positive stereotypes. A common stereotype that we see on TV is like the smart Asian guy, right? Who's usually, sort of clumsy when it comes to social environments, but bust out a calculator and he can compute anything, right? This is a portrayal in art, and those stereotypes get uh, perpetuated into areas in which they can do real harm, right? And so that again goes towards you know any sort of community that might be discriminated against, and have uh, that does not have the power to correct that sort of behavior, right? I think it's interesting too when we think about media and globalism to see what has changed over the years. So if we think about our media, even just 40 or 50 years ago, um, and going back to the 80s, uh, if we look at, let's say, television, right? Television itself, um, there was like 5 or 6 channels, right? When I was growing up, we had channel 2, 4, 6, 7, 9, and then eventually channel 31, right? So 6 channels there, and that was it. That was all the television that we could receive, and we didn't have streaming services, we didn't have cable, that was it. So the media that was presented to us was very limited. Uh, Print newspaper was very popular. It's common to just be able to go out, find a newspaper stand, buy a newspaper, and you can get your daily international and domestic news through the paper. Even watching the nightly news, it was, half-hour segment maybe on local news, and that's not a lot to cover when you've got a large population of stuff going on. Um, and then you had other means and books, right? Radio was certainly a big one, and there was more and more radio stations. Um, but that was kind of how media was covered. Even journalism was practiced differently. We go back to the sort of the Walter Cronkite days of journalism, and if you don't know who Walter Cronkite is, look him up. He's sort of the granddaddy of 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 journalism, of TV journalism. Uh, but the way that he did things was to tell the news, right? This is what happened today, and this is what were the consequences of this happening. Not, I feel like he did this or I feel like he did that. Not opinions, right? Not editorials, but the news, right? Just telling what was going on in the world. Um, and that has certainly changed from the news of Walter Cronkite um, to the news of today, and where you have more talking heads telling their opinion versus telling what is actually happening. And so that's really important to sort of pay attention to, is what kind of information you're actually getting. Um, so this changed our culture drastically, right? As we have gained access to new media resources and modern day technology, we are able to share different stories. Um, when I think about events like the North Dakota pipeline, I think this was a really important event that changed sort of the way that we look at big news events that aren't covered by mainstream media. The thing that the North Dakota pipeline really sort of exemplified was that a large scale event can take place and it was only shared through social media. The main media sources, local news, they weren't picking up on it or choosing not to pick up on it um, for one reason or another. Either they were not paying attention, which is hardly the case, or that they were choosing not to, which is probably more likely. The interesting thing is that you had people out there with their cell phones recording events, recording the daily experience, and sharing that experience through social media, which was then getting spread throughout the country. Um, and people were finding out about it, but they weren't seeing it on the news. They were only seeing it on social media platforms. Um, and that is a huge change in capability of the democratization of information sharing, right? And this becomes really important to sort of understand that um, where we once experienced media only coming from, those select few media sources, now we've got media where everyone can share that media source with someone else, right? I experienced this today. This is my experience. I'm going to share it, and then lots and lots and lots of other people can experience it with you. And that creates its own issues, right? Um, because uh, when we think about like misinformation or disinformation, um, what stories are being told, how do you collaborate them or corroborate them, how do you uh, experience that news, who has access to that technology, and that's important to kind of consider. um, all right, so let's think about for a second visual anthropology. And this is a field that I am in particularly. That's what I went for grad school for. Visual anthropology really deals with the capture of information um, in a different way than traditional ethnographers would capture that information. A lot of times, cultural anthropologists would write down their observations, they would write articles or books, sometimes including visuals, but not always. And in visual anthropology, we focus on that visual aspect. Right? This is the important thing that we are seeing, and we're going to have you experience that through that visualization. Um, but there are also problems with that as well, right? If we think about, uh, uh, that old saying, "A photo is worth a thousand words." Well, that's only one perception, right? The video is only going to show you one particular viewpoint, but that particular viewpoint can be really important. And this is why it's important to consider visual anthropology as sort of a new necessary mode of doing ethnographic fieldwork. And it's because we are recording the actual instance of that community, of that individual, of them telling that story, of the inflection in their voice, the clothing that they wear, the environment that they're in, all becomes a part of that story. um, so it's important to think about that as a process, right? As a way of capturing more information. Then we have ethnographic film, um, and again, this is telling the story. Then there's limitations when it comes to doing this and portraying people. And I think this is important to recognize because even though I'm a huge advocate for doing ethnographic film work, we also have to understand that there have been in the past times when that ethnographic work could have caused damage. And an example would be like the Yanomamo peoples in the Amazon. Uh, some early anthropologists went down there and recorded what it was like to live in those villages and to be a part of the community. And oftentimes, there was violence that was involved, and the Yanomamo people got this reputation as being literally the most violent people in the world, and that perpetuated this ideology. When you actually look at the Yanomamo people, then that portrayal is not entirely honest, but it was portrayed and perpetuated um, by those films. And that's the important thing that we have to understand when we're watching the news, when we're watching a documentary. Um, how real, how justified, how much effort went into proving this is correct. Um, right, there's a show that came out not too long ago on Netflix, and I'm trying to remember the name. It's something to do with like the world apocalypse, right? And in this show, basically the guy was talking about all these archaeological sites and how they all sort of connected to this um, one particular culture that was possibly missing, that some sort of uh, technologically advanced culture that is no longer here. And that all of these different sites around the world couldn't have been built without this technologically advanced culture. Um, and most anthropologists would just flat out claim, BS, right? We don't need technologically advanced cultures to create the pyramids or to create the ziggurats in Central America or in Mexico. You just needed smart people, which there were lots of smart people there, and time and resources to build them, and they had time and resources to build them. It's not any more complicated than that. But a lot of people saw this documentary series and were like, oh, well, obviously, there must be aliens, or there must be some sort of lost culture that went around helping people to build these, and that's just simply um, not plausible, right? So you have to really pay attention to what you are being told when experiencing documentaries and art and all of this stuff. Um, one of the things that ethnographic films are really good at is allowing the voice of the people to actually be heard. And this is a really important thing when conducting ethnographic filmmaking, is that you include the voice of the people. In traditional ethnographies, it's oftentimes the voice of the anthropologist that gets heard, right? They're the ones that are writing the journal entry, or they're writing the book, but rarely is it ever portrayed that the people that are being interviewed or being discussed about are actually a part of the research project. And this is where ethnographic film, really shines brightly, is that it allows them to participate in the actual portrayal of their culture and their community. Um, and so ethnographic films are a very, very powerful tool if done in a way that allows that culture to express itself. And there are sometimes problems with this because just like anyone, you want to put your best foot forward. So people are usually not as easily convinced to share the negative things about their community or their culture or their experience. So that has to be taken into consideration as well. It also allows people that would normally not have the chance to to speak, to share their identity, that capability, and then to have that voice being heard by a multitude of other people, to be given um, the venue in which to be able to do that. So that can definitely help. At the same time, if you're taking this and running in the opposite direction, only exemplifying the bad, right, then that can also create fear and hate and that kind of stuff. Um, so we have to be exceptionally vigilant about what we consume, right? And I think a lot of times you need to think about who the audience is when you're looking at uh, an ethnographic film, right? And what could be the implications. I think about Nanook of the North as the first documentary film ever created, the first feature-length film ever created, and the consequences of what happened to that film afterwards. That film, came to the States in the early 1920s and went around the country. But one of the things that happened is that there's a scene in the film where there was a whole bunch of Arctic foxes that their pelts had been collected. And all of those Arctic foxes, man, they looked attractive. At that time, you know, fur pelts were all the rage. Um, and so that actually drove the market up for more consumption of fur pelts, right? And it created ecotourism. People wanted to go up into the Arctic and experience it for themselves. So it created a drive for people to go up into those locations and experience themselves. So even by creating that film and creating that story for people to learn about that culture, that had unintended consequences. And anytime that you do a film, right, you might find that there are unintended consequences. So, as sort of a final exercise here, how do you deal with overwhelming amounts of information? I think this is a really important question to ask because in today's society, we are inundated with data, right? You turn on your computer, you turn on your television, it's on your phone, it's on your tablet, it's everywhere, right? How do you deal with all of that information? And how do you determine what is misinformation and what is truth? And how do you determine the difference between truth and fact? And that's an interesting question because, throughout this semester, we've talked about, theoretical truth and ground truth, right? Um, and truth and fact are two different things. People can experience their own truth, but that doesn't necessarily make it fact. It just makes it an experience, right? Because again, truth is something that is experiential for the individual. They've experienced this thing, they've seen it happen, uh, and that is their truth. But the overall fact might be different. I mean, I think about, in this case, like flat earthers, right? Someone that believes that the earth is flat. They have walked around their entire lives on flat ground, right? They look out into the distance and it all looks flat, right? They don't see the curvature of the earth. They don't know that the earth is a sphere floating in space. They see it as flat, right? Their truth, they're not lying, they're not trying to deceive anyone. Their truth is that the earth is flat. We know for a fact it's not. It's not flat. Right? It's a globe. It's floating in space. But that doesn't necessarily discount their experience of their truth. And that is something that we oftentimes have to deal with in a very important way, especially as anthropologists, is that when we come across that sort of misunderstanding of how the world works, it's not a judgment moment, right? We're not there to say, oh, you're wrong, right? The earth is round. We want to say, okay, how do you know that the earth is flat, right? Tell me about it, right? Did you learn this from your parents? Did you learn about this from the media? Did you learn about this through whatever process it was? So you have to, instead of taking that moment to create that space of fact and possibly alienating the people that you're working with, again, you want to sort of separate yourself from that bias of understanding and ask those questions, right? Ask the question of uh, this this is what you believe. Tell me why, right? Give me that information. I want to know more about it, and try and not necessarily create that moment of difference and of changing perception, but to understand why. And a lot of times when people experience that, when they experience like, oh, this is maybe not as ideal as I thought it was. Once I try and explain it, uh, maybe they can come around to whatever that fact is. But that's a difficult place to go to, right? Trying to deal with misinformation, um, especially when you believe that it's a trusted source, right? And we see this a lot when it comes to mass media, when it comes to the big networks, whether it's Fox News or CNN. Um, who's telling what, and what is it that they're trying to convince you to believe in? And I believe that anytime that you're watching like a major news source, you should always have a healthy sense of skepticism. And if you want to believe something that someone said, find more sources that collaborate with um, that idea, that thought, that little bit of information that they shared. If you can find lots of sources that support it, good chance it's worth supporting. If you don't, you might want to question it some more. So, I think that's really important to consider when you're faced with looking at the media and looking at what's being told, when you're seeing the portrayal of individuals of different races, of different ethnicities, from different cultures around the world, that is a truthful portrayal. You should question that. And if you question it, that's okay. It might be right, and it's okay to question, right? We need to be critical thinkers about um, our community, about our society, about our world, and the things that we learn. It's good to be critical, so that we can affirm that this is a fact, this is the truth, right? Because truth can be different for different people. And so we should find out what that truth actually looks like for those different people. So, in conclusion, right, art is something to experience, but it is also used as a tool, right? The creation of art, the display of art can reinforce ideologies, can reinforce behaviors in different communities. When we think about Western art and the importance that it's had on our own society, on the development of the West in general, and how that's having an influence on communities around the world, it cannot be understated how much of an influence Western art has actually had. If only because it's placed the value of art in different ways, right? What is that fine art? What is primitive art? What is art that exemplifies or vilifies a particular group of people? Um, How do they see themselves? This becomes really important to understand how that art is seen, how it is portrayed, and the people creating or uh, sharing that. And then globalism has changed greatly how art is created, how it is shared, and how it is influencing places around the world, and what that means to these different communities. So it's important to think about those things. And then a final note: um, just pay attention to your own ideas about the portrayal of people, in the media. Um, be open-minded, be critical of what you're seeing, what you're hearing. Um, Oftentimes, I would ask you to think about who the audience is. If you're watching the news, who's the audience that this, particular news segment is, trying to attach itself to. Think about those things. Be critical. Be critical of everything. Everything that you listen to, everything that you learn, you should be thinking critically about what kind of an impact that's going to have on yourself and on your community in general. Okay, that's it. Um, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. And until next time, take it easy.